So I hope everyone can hear me. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. A very warm welcome to all of you joining and taking the time for today's webinar, Trends in Open Access, provided to you by the Inago Academy. My name is Frauke Ralf. And believe it or not, I have been involved in the open access paradigm shift since 1998. It's a pretty long time, actually. At IOP Publishing, we started to experiment with the phenomenon without even knowing what it would be called. Actually, this webinar is part of a larger event, which I'm happy to contribute to today. It is the Open Access Week, from October 22nd to 28th. And this year's Open Access Week is under the motto, Designing Equitable Foundations for Open Knowledge. And I'm hoping very much to be able to contribute to that. And I hope you enjoy the forthcoming 45 minutes. Let's have a look where the journey is going to take us over the next few 45 minutes. We are starting off with benefits to open access, a bit of history telling about the evolution, open access journals as a few examples, and the repositories. Then we move on to open science, out of which open access is a very predominant part. And I will give you a few examples how persistent identifiers actually work, what the legal situation is under open access, and what funder mandates and policies might mean to you, including a few recent developments. Before we start and discuss open access, let's briefly have a look at the traditional publishing model and its slight flaws. The traditional publishing model was actually based on accepted papers being published in journals, pretty obvious. Libraries then had to pay annual fees of a certain amount up to $25,000, sometimes $30,000 to subscribe to these journals. From the year 2000, held mostly on digital databases. So that means the author published for free and had, as a consequence, quite little influence and awareness on the economical situation of his affiliated library. And the library had to purchase back, if you wish, the content produced at the author's very own institution. Quite ironical, if you can think about it in that way. So that means this model was not only economically questionable and led to the so-called serious crisis, but scientific articles or scholarly articles also had very limited visibility under this traditional way of scientific publishing. So since then, the life cycle of the scholarly research workflow changed a lot towards open access and open science. So what happened was, due to the serious crisis actually starting in the late 1990s, it was a kind of global transition towards open access caused by the library's continuous budget cutbacks and the publishers actually constantly increasing their prices for subscriptions. And out of that situation, faculties asked their libraries to support a completely new scholarly communication model, and open access was born. The very first examples were the Public Library of Science and Biomed Central. Both initiatives were founded in 2000. So what does it actually mean, the so-called access publishing model? What is, you see a quite clear definition here on this slide. And what it actually reads out to you is that the traditional system for communication research used a print-based model, as we all know, but it was used in the digital age, which became more and more kind of ironic, according to the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, which defined open access, as you can see here in the slide. So even though research is largely still produced by using public funds, the results are hidden behind technical, legal, and financial barriers. And these partly artificially viewed barriers or considered barriers are maintained by publishers, as to now, and they restrict access to a small fraction of users who can actually afford to pay their subscription fees. The mismatch between what is actually possible technically in the digital age led to the inception of an open system of communication, also nowadays known as open science or the open access model. So it is actually both a business model and a movement, and open science is actually a paradigm shift. So this is where this definition is actually coming from, provided by Spark. So when we go and continue to look at the open access model, you see that as opposed to the first slide to describe the traditional subscription model, on the first row, very little has actually changed. But the gold open access model changes in the second row, where you can see that the payment is no longer made for subscriptions, for example, but prior to its publication in an open access journal to be paid by the author, the institution, the library, or a funder. And what it means, upon publication, this article will be visible to the global communities, to everybody, all audiences, instantly via the web, and reusage licenses will be applying. And in the end, we hope it leads to accelerated scientific progress and maybe maximized return on public investment. So that is to describe the open access model in a very brief overview. So why should a researcher or an author actually publish open access? What are the benefits? Well, first of all, we have seen over the past few years, the past 2 decades, an increased visibility, and that has clearly been monitored so that we can see open access articles are more seen, read, and shared than any subscription article. It does enjoy an increased citation rate, and that means 60% of the open access articles are likely to be cited, as opposed to 38% of subscription-based material. Another benefit is, of course, the global impact and driving innovation. And when it comes to driving innovation, we have seen that now increasing our view a little bit towards open science. It drives innovation to an extent that we have seen from the open sources movement in the information technology, and a lot of innovation has been driven into commercial corporates and into the industry by these open sources facilities, and that counts in the same way if you publish open access. So it does drive innovation as well as global impact. And what it also leads to is it creates a completely new community, or many new communities, as audiences reading your article or looking into it. And that can actually extend to including teachers, educators, business owners, other people working in a subject area of your interest, and all of those will be able to read your content. And last but not least, it is a way to actually comply with increasing funder mandates to actually publish your research results, open access, as well as their policies. So this is in a nutshell what the benefits are about. Just a little bit of storytelling. So we went back to the evolution of open access in 1991, and this is when the first preprint server was launched, called ORCID. And the idea was coming from the high energy physics community to actually digitally deposit a manuscript without peer review, without evaluation or assessment, onto a digital server and everybody in that rather small community of high energy physics researchers could have a look at this manuscript and comment on it. And so that was the year the preprint server archive was born. And since then, we nowadays see a total, if you wish, renaissance of more and more preprint servers being launched, especially in the life sciences, and this is a quite new development. So archive was for many years the only one existing, and of course it was extended to include other communities from mathematics into condensed matter physics, engineering, etc., etc. So that was when the preprint servers were born. Then we move on to 1998 when Spark, I mentioned with respect to the definition of open access, was actually created, and another platform came to life called Cielo. That platform was created in Brazil, and it was actually initiated to serve the researchers and authors from Portuguese, Spanish, and English language in order to provide them with open access solutions on that platform and access to their own content, because simply Brazil and many other Latin American, South American countries could simply not afford subscriptions any longer. So that is the year 1998 when Cielo and Spark were both launched. Then we move on to the 2002 launched Budapest Open Access Initiative and Berlin Declaration, both of which have been signed by more than 500 institutions by now. 2005 and 6 saw the Creative Commons reusability or reuse licenses being born, as well as a new open access business model called hybrid. And what that means is that normal subscription-based classic journals open up in order to include individual open access articles. So all of that goes back to 95 and 96. And then we move on to a few more research-based developments. Very important is the Force 11 initiative, actually bringing to the table a lot more practical guidelines, how to actually make your research accessible in an open science world. And we have a few initiatives being launched recently, starting in 2014, but continuously growing from the European Union. So now let's have a look at a few open access organizations. I just want to name 2 or 3 of them. These organizations are notable international ones, advocating and providing an infrastructure for open access publishing. And this list is not complete, but it shows that these initiatives have continuously engaged in open access in a very convincing way. And just to name 2, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the so-called DOAJ, is the only directory evaluating and looking into the quality of a newly founded gold open access journal. And this is the most important directory we've seen so far in order to make sure that the quality is high of open access journals, as well as providing a complete assessment and evaluation of each journal being founded and being launched. And just to give you one example, they had around about 11,000 journals on their directory 3 years ago, and that has been reduced due to review of the evaluation process to 6,500. So that is, if you wish, a guarantee for the quality of an open access journal provided by the University Lund. This is where DOAJ was actually launched. I think it was back in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. Another very important institution by now is the OASPA, and that is the organization of open access scholarly publishers, and they also provide a lot of help when it comes to choosing, selecting, publishing, or adding data to open access journals. So this is just to give you a brief overview which organizations do exist out there. So this slide just shows you where we are today. We started with 3 initiatives in the year 2000, the New Journal of Physics, in which I have been heavily involved at that time, together with all of my colleagues from the editorial teams. We launched the New Journal of Physics, and I must admit, I'm proud to tell you that this is the general physics journal, open access journal by now. So this was a very important initiative at the time when we didn't even know what open access was as a term, or whether that would be invented, very early stages, together with Biomed Central and the Public Library of Science. And in 2017, you can see how many different publishers actually engage one way or another in open access and open science, all on different levels. So when it comes to the open access routes, we have 2 different ways to go when it comes to open access publishing. One is the gold route, and I mentioned that this gold route is split into 2 opportunities. One is to publish in a genuine gold open access journal, and the other one is the hybrid solution, meaning that you do publish an open access article in a subscription-based journal as an individual contribution to open access. The gold route means that you do submit and publish in a traditional journal, subscription-based most of the time, but you at the same time deposit your manuscript in a repository. And we call that the green route, as a way of self-archiving your content. This is in a very brief overview, just to give you an idea what the 2 routes are to publish open access. So how can you actually make your research open access? So as said, you have the 2 routes, the green one in the middle. And if you want to check, for example, which open access and self-archiving options are out there in the world, depending on the institution you're affiliated with, then you can check that on Sherpa-Romeo, which is very important initiative going back to the University of Nottingham, and they provide you with an open access institutional repository overview, who does what in open access at which institution, basically. So you have the gold route. If you see the first few items and icons, you can see that you can either publish in an open access journal gold, choosing the gold route, and then paying a so-called article publishing or processing charge if that is required, and your article will instantly be fully available over the web. Or you choose a hybrid journal that also leads to gold open access, but that article will be included in a subscription-based journal, which leads to quite a few questions around the so-called double dipping. You might have heard that. So that means we do ask, is the librarian or the user or the author actually charged twice? That means once for the article publication charge and another time for the content to be paid for under the subscription model. Quite a big debate behind that. I won't go into the details here in this webinar. And then again, you have the green route, which means you self-archive one version of your article in a repository of your choice. So when it comes to the open access fees, as you have seen, it is not free. And usually the publishers charge between, for social science and humanities, below $1,000. But when it comes to sciences, it can go up to $3,500. And very often that is an article publication charge. With respect to subscription-based hybrid journals such as Nature, The Cell, Lancet, etc., etc. So it can be quite high. And these APCs cover costs for as you know from the traditional model for editorial and peer review, production, indexing, metadata creation, digital data creation and distribution, customer services, of course, you still need that for the distribution and marketing. So in general, these fees are then paid by the author, the researcher, the funding body via the grants, or the universities and research institutions themselves. Let's now move on to a brief overview when it comes to the open access repositories and preprint servers. So basically you have two different types. One is the subject and disciplinary repositories, such as PubMed Central, one of the most important ones when it comes to life sciences and medicine. And then you have the institutional repositories, and those ones can be based at your very own institution. It is always, when it comes to repositories, the question, are they preprint or post-publication? Preprint, as I have mentioned, archive.org is one preprint server, bioRxiv is another one. PubMed and PubMed Central are repositories which actually accept your deposits after publication. So we have that distinction between the different types of repositories. Let's sink that in a little while, and we move on to so-called predatory journals and conferences. And what this is about, we have seen that predatory journals and as well as conferences are undesirable byproducts of the open access movement, unfortunately. And such journals tend to imitate the legitimate ones in the open science and open access world in order to just extract money. And they don't really aspire to provide quality or peer review or any kind of publication support as you might be used to from the subscription-based journals. So beware of the predatory journals and conferences. And there are two opportunities, two options to check out. One, I have listed a few tips how you could check whether the journal you wish to publish in is actually eligible or the conference is worthwhile attending. And one initiative is called Think, Check, Submit, and the other one, that's for the journals, and the other one is called Think, Check, Attend. So I invite you to, whenever you have a doubt on the quality of a certain conference, open access conference, or open science related journal, just go to these two initiatives. Just a few examples where you can also check on the open access journals and its quality. I have already mentioned DOAJ, but there's also, of course, mentioned before Cielo and another initiative called BASE at the University of Bielefeld, where you can check for open access quality journals and its content as well, just to name a few. Okay, another opportunity to check for the quality of an open access journal is the Inago created open access journal finder. And what you do here is simply add the abstract of your manuscript, and the system will come out with around about 5 very good open access and highly qualified open access journal suggestions. And I say high qualified because all of these journals are evaluated by the DOAJ. So this OAJ F provided by Inago, the open access journal finder, is actually existing in close cooperation with the DOAJ, validating and certifying those journals, which we will suggest to you. It's around about 4 coming out depending on your subject area once you do this search. Let's now move, given the time, move on to open science. As you can see, open access is a very important part of open science, but it's only a part. And the difficulties with the reproducibility, accountability, assessment, and evaluation of research results as well as a series of very recent high-profile retractions of articles, have encouraged the open science movement. And the aim of open science is to actually make the entire process of scientific knowledge retrieval and exploitation transparent. And that means from the very initial idea through to the pre-registration process up to the final result and its publication. So the credo is behind open science: publicly funded research should be publicly accessible, reusable, and reproducible, as well as transparent. So this is what the idea of open science is about. And as you can see, we have various parts. And I would say that we are pretty much established when it comes to open access and open source by now. Open source dealing with information technology. So these two have gone and have come a long way and are pretty established. We are now in the phase of defining and putting into practicability open data and open research, open educational resources. So this is the next step the open science movement is looking into, and actually developing guidelines, etc., in order to make it easier for everyone to produce open educational resources as well as deposit open data. The forthcoming two parts of open science, as far as I can see, are open citations and citizen science. So let's have a very brief look into peer review as opposed to open peer review as opposed to the traditional one. So if you remember, double-blind and single-blind peer reviewing is used within the traditional reviewing process for subscription-based journals. So double-blind is usually used for social science and humanity journals, and single-blind, where only the reviewer knows who the author is, but not the other way around, is most commonly used in science journals. So when it comes to open peer review, the form and the names of the reviewers are disclosed. And also, when it comes to open disclosure, the reviewer comments are open and made available alongside with a published article. And a few examples of publishers and journals actually practicing this open peer review method is PLOS ONE, for example, the Royal Society Open, British Medical Journal Open, Copernicus, and PeerJ. That's just to give you an idea what open peer review could be about. And I would like to mention one initiative which has proved to be very successful. That's Publons. So Publons is actually a reviewer recognition service which provides a central point in which referees and reviewers can record their peer review activity and can monitor its success as well. That is just to cover the open peer review aspect in this webinar. Let's now move on to another phenomenon being an important part of the open science paradigm shift. That's the scholarly so-called communication or collaboration networks. And they allow authors to share, network, and upload their data and their content. And it also gives, in some platforms of these so-called SCNs, you can also have metrics. Beware that some of these platforms are considered to be more or less legal. I wouldn't say more than that. The three I mentioned, Mendeley, Academia, Edu, and ResearchGate, do or are continuously in debate with the related publishers who actually publish paywalled content, which is sometimes illegally uploaded on these platforms and on these networks. But there are legal options under the green open access model as well. And I just named one, which is Science Open. So there are options out there to be, for the authors and researchers, 100% on the safe side when it comes to sharing and uploading your own content into scholarly communication networking systems. Okay, let's move on to another aspect of open science, which is the share of open data or making your data. What are the advantages? I think it does ensure transparency of the entire research process, and in the end it checks for your own good quality of your research. It can do. In the end, or further down the road, or the life cycle of your research, it does lead to reusability, reproducibility, and in the end, maybe a better science. That's why advocates of the open science movement encourage the authors and researchers to publish their data and to share their data under the so-called FAIR principles introduced by the European Open Science Cloud. And FAIR stands for findable data, accessible data, interoperable data, and reusable data. So these are the FAIR principles to share data widely open. The reasons, we do know there are quite a few reasons maybe to overcome for not sharing your data, and that might be that you fear kind of malicious reuse, or that there's a competitive edge to your research, which is very well understood, of course. That very often we do face practical reasons. Either my data is too big or too time consuming to prepare, the status of my lab notes aren't good enough maybe, and sometimes in the laboratories and faculties, it's just not the cultural norm yet to share the data. There are a few journals which took the risk to only accept your manuscript together with the provision of your data, and that's PLOS, for example. They have taken the risk to make that mandatory. So that's just to give you a brief overview of what is actually possible and where to store your data, in which repositories, and out of these options, again divided into institutional repositories and subject-related data repositories. I just named one, which is the Center of Open Science, the Center for Open Science, based at the Technical University in Virginia. And I think they have come very far in a very professional way to encourage the entire research, development, and publication process to become open, including all aspects of the research. And I think they provide a very, very good service to understand the complete process and to help you with everything from adding your data to the repository, pre-register your research and your project right up to its publication. So this is just the possibilities of data repositories now that this gets increasingly shared. There are data journals as well, which you can have a look at. There are quite a few by now, just to name two of them. Very often that's used just to produce the data and to put the data and to make it more visible via the journals, but it can also be done through or via the repositories. Okay. Another aspect of actually making your open access content as widely visible as possible are persistent identifiers. And I cannot emphasize enough the necessity of making sure that either your publisher, or if you publish yourself or your institution, create as much metadata, correct metadata around your research content as possible. It is a wide debate who is responsible for what, and what I'm doing in this webinar is only mentioning two persistent identifiers which became state-of-the-art and standard by now, and one is the digital object identifier. There's not a single publisher out in this world, scholarly publisher anymore, not using the digital object identifier to to be widely used to index your content, and also cross-ref and data side use DOIs in order to put it and to add it to your metadata for your research to be findable. And another persistent identifier which is seeing increasing usage and registration is the Open Research and Contributor ID called ORCID, and that is now extensively used by researchers in order to clearly identify you as an author and researcher, no matter what your affiliation is throughout your professional research career. Now, let's move on in the next few minutes to the legal aspect of open access. Although copyright laws differ across countries, they are primarily designed to protect a person and organization to whom the copyright belongs. So you all might know this. Traditionally, in subscription-based journals, the copyrights were transferred to the publisher once the article, prior to publication, or sometimes also after the article was published. So in an open access model, the copyright, the intellectual property, is retained by the author, and only the permission to publish the article open access is given to the publisher via the transfer agreement. That is still necessary to do, but the copyright is retained by the person wanting to publish in an open access world. What does change a lot, here are a few tips just how to make sure that you do identify the legal situation of the journal of your choice, whether that is hybrid, subscription-based, or pure gold open access. You do need to check on these licenses, and what significantly changes the situation in open access is the second layer of copyrights and licenses, and that relates to the Creative Commons initiative. And what they did is they regulated and introduced 6 different licenses to be used in the open science, open access world to make sure that your content can be reused legally. And I just talk you through the first one on the left, and that, if you wish, is the license which allows reusability or reuse of your content on a very large scale, as long as you name the creator of the content. Once you're done with the attribution, actually saying who created the content and attributing the author, you can reuse the content commercially, non-commercially, for your own purposes. You can share the content, you can actually rewrite the content, etc., etc. All of that is possible under a so-called CC BY license for reuse of your content under the open access model. The option which actually restricts this reuse on a larger scale, so it's a lot more restrictive, is the license mentioned at the bottom on the left, the so-called CC BY and C and D Creative Commons license, and that indicates that you have to attribute where the content is coming from. You cannot change it. You have to leave the text and the content as it was and as it is, and you cannot use it commercially. This is actually introduced, this license, by quite a few publishers from the, if you wish, traditional side. The mandates from the funders are actually most of the time asking to license your content under a CC BY license, the widest reusability of your content. So that's it when it comes to the legal side. Funder mandates, what does that mean for you? These mandates coming from institutions like the UK-based Wellcome Trust, the EU, European Research Council, or the Austrian FWF, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the National Institute of Health. all of these funders actually ask you to publish your content if you are funded by them and you have a grant with its number for your project to be published in one way or another open access, and that can include green or gold. If gold, of course, an APC has to be paid. And sometimes these article publication charges, when you are funded by an agency, are capped. So if it's, for example, with the German Research Council, they cap the APCs at 2,000 euros. So if you wish to spend more for your journal, for your article to be published in an open access journal, you have to pay it either by yourself or you get it paid by your laboratory and institution. So some of these APCs are capped by the funders. And when it comes to the green open access model, usually what the mandates are is they do tolerate embargoes, and an embargo means you can deposit your manuscript, sometimes also the final version, on a repository of your choice or a given one, after, let's say, 12 months. Sometimes there's no embargo. Most of the times, the funders now ask you to deposit your manuscript, if possible, by the publisher, if allowed, by them without an embargo. That means instantly upon publication of an article. So that's when it comes, very briefly, when it comes to funder mandates. Let's go into a few recent developments. So Europe has been very active over the past few years to launch their frame programs, making open access mandatory to publications. And that is, for example, the European Union's Research and Innovation Funding Program, being continued, I would assume, after 2020. And another not so recent development, but very important, is the launch of the OA 2020 roadmap presented by the Max Planck Digital Library. For those among you not being too familiar, Max Planck Society is the biggest German basic research institution and funder, and it's one of the biggest in the world. And they introduced a roadmap intending to offer just a framework and some guidelines for practical steps towards the transformation to open access. And that includes help for libraries as well as for publishers. So that was a pretty recent development, and it created a lot of sound around it and a lot of debate and discussions, because in the white paper they produced, they suggested a limit of or a capped APC of 2,000 euros. And they said in this paper that it should be possible to transform the entire scholarly publication output into open access for this price. Another recent development is, of course, the creation of OpenAIR as the central repository for the open access initiatives provided by the European Union. And since they launched the Open Science Policy Platform, as well as the European Science Cloud. A very recent, that came up over the past few weeks, very recent development was the Plan S, and that is provided by the Coalition S, and they say S stands for smart, I would put it. The CCC, the Copyright Clearance Center, called it smart the other day. So I think that's a very good explanation. So the Coalition S, smart, is actually a consortium consisting of 11 European-based research funding organizations, and they support not only the European Commission and the European Research Council, but they wanted to launch this plan to accelerate the transition to full and immediate open access to scientific publications by 2020. And that was basically launched a few weeks ago in order to accelerate the whole process, because it was seen as too slow to move into the open access, open science transition. So just let it sink in for a minute, or no, not a minute, but a few seconds. And what could you take away, hopefully, from this webinar you're still enjoying? I know it is long, but do believe me, if there's anything you didn't understand, don't hesitate to ask. And secondly, we will also providing you with a Q&A after this session. And you always have the option to go into the app of Imago Academy, where we do have a lot of material about open access and open science available to you. So don't worry if it's a bit much at this point. It took me 15 years to understand open science, so I think we should all not panic, and everybody should take his or her time to let open access and open science sink in. So what can you take away? Publishing in open access journals improves your visibility. It does improve the impact of research. The reusability via the Creative Commons licenses and the reproducibility via open access and open data. You can find legitimate open access journals on the DOAJ or the Open Access Journal Finder provided by Imago. And you should be using, in order to check against predatory journals and conferences, on Think, Check, Submit or Think, Check, Attend. As well as you might want to look into getting an ORCID. I can only reassure you it is very easy, very useful, and it can be used throughout the entire rest or beginning of your research life cycle. I can only encourage you to do that. Then data sharing should be actually looked into on a subject-related or institutional repository. You should also check out your compliance of your publication and research with pre- and post-print servers and policies on Sherpa Romeo. That is clarifying on what mandates, funder mandates are out there, and also which policies are actually introduced by the individual publishers. So to cut a very long story short, open access and open science are both here to stay. So even if a lot of politics and diplomacy is going on since 1998, a lot of discussions, this is a paradigm shift which cannot be talked away or put under the carpet. So, because if you do sit back a bit and let it sink in and think about open science and open access again, it's not more and not less than the entire revision of the scientific knowledge production, its retrieval and evaluation process. So this is what this movement really is about. And I think this is very important to understand as a background. So for further information, we put together a few links for you, including everything from the very basic understanding to a bit more advanced and latest developments, as well as the app, which I shouldn't forget to mention to you. At this point, thank you very much to everyone for listening for about an hour to what open access and open science is all about. And please do get back to us with your questions, and we can always chat, and you should be using and downloading our Imago Academy app. Thank you very much for listening.